She arrived at the courthouse with a newborn sleeping against her chest, and her husband's family had already decided how this would end. They expected tears. They expected begging for a settlement, for dignity, for anything at all. What they got instead was a woman who said almost nothing, because 3 nights earlier, while they popped champagne and celebrated her downfall, Madison Carter had already signed the one document that would hand her their entire kingdom. Her husband sat across the room smiling, his mistress beside him wearing diamonds that used to be Madison's. His mother leaned in and whispered 4 words that would later define this entire case. "Throw her out. A woman with a baby and no money has no power," she said. And Ethan Carter, golden heir to one of the largest holding companies in the state, laughed in front of his own lawyers and ordered security to remove his wife and newborn daughter from the room. What none of them understood, not Ethan, not his mother, not the woman wearing Madison's old diamonds, was that the company they had built their entire identity around no longer belonged to them. It belonged to her. And in the next 60 seconds, every person in that courtroom was about to learn exactly who they had spent years underestimating. The room went quiet enough that Madison could hear her daughter's breathing against her chest, soft and even, completely unaware of the storm settling over the room around her. Ethan stared at his wife as though he had misheard her. His smile stayed fixed on his face, but it had gone stiff, the way a smile does when the person wearing it no longer believes in it. Beside him, Vanessa Monroe slowly lowered the phone she had been using to record the moment, the one she had planned to keep for herself later. The camera trembled in her hand. Before we go any further into how this moment came to exist, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We would love to hear from you, and if this is the kind of story that keeps you thinking long after it ends, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happens over the next 2 hours is going to change how you think about every quiet woman you have ever underestimated. To understand how Madison Carter ended up standing in that courtroom with more power than the family trying to humiliate her, you have to go back nearly a decade to a narrow brick house on the edge of Baltimore, where the heating rattled through the walls every winter and her mother counted grocery money twice before walking into the store. Madison grew up the daughter of Thomas Reed, a quiet, careful accountant who never had his name on an office door, who worked for companies that valued his precision and never once promoted him past where they felt comfortable. Thomas was the kind of man who noticed everything and said very little, and he raised his daughter the same way. He taught her numbers before he taught her anything else, sliding old financial statements across the kitchen table on evenings when most fathers were watching television. "When people want to hide the truth," he used to tell her, "they bury it in numbers. Learn to read the numbers, and nobody can lie to you for long." Madison absorbed that lesson the way other children absorb nursery rhymes. By the time she was 16, she could find a missing decimal point in a spreadsheet faster than her teachers could finish grading a test. By 21, she had scholarships, academic honors, and internship offers from firms that praised her talent in interviews and then quietly asked, in language just vague enough to avoid a lawsuit, whether she would be a good fit for their culture. She understood exactly what that meant, and she filed it away the same way her father had taught her to file away every uncomfortable fact. By 28, she had built the early foundation of an investment firm called Whitestone Meridian, though almost none of the people writing checks to fund it ever knew her name. They preferred to believe the strategy behind it belonged to a gray-haired man in a Navy suit, because that was the version of competence they were used to trusting. That man was Charles Whitmore, a retired mergers and acquisitions veteran who had been her father's closest friend for over 30 years, and who owed Thomas Reed a debt that no amount of money could ever fully repay. When Thomas got sick, Charles showed up at their small house every single Thursday evening, carrying soup, legal pads, and stories about boardrooms where powerful men had lost everything because they assumed the quietest person in the room had nothing worth listening to. "Power," Charles told Madison once, while her father slept exhausted in the next room, "is not always loud. Sometimes power sits quietly in the corner, takes notes, and buys the entire building while everyone else is busy arguing over the furniture." Madison never forgot that sentence. She would carry it with her into rooms far more dangerous than her father's modest living room. When Thomas Reed died, he left his daughter 3 things: a scratched old wristwatch that had kept time through 3 decades of careful, unglamorous work. A short letter, simply telling her how proud he was of the woman she had become. And a warning, scrawled on the back of an old invoice from a company called Carter Global Holdings, dated 20 years earlier, from a brief contract job he had once done for them. "Do not trust the Carter family," the warning read, "with your heart or your money." At the time, grief made Madison assume her father had simply been dramatic in his final weeks, reaching for meaning in old grudges. Years later, after she had already fallen in love with a man named Ethan Carter, she almost threw that warning away entirely. She folded it instead and placed it in a locked drawer, telling herself the past did not always have to be a map for the future. Ethan Carter, when Madison met him, was not yet the polished heir to a holding company empire. He was 28 years old, standing under the weak yellow light of a gas station canopy during a sudden storm, soaked through his shirt because he had just given Madison his jacket without thinking twice about it. He told her, rain dripping from his hair, that he did not want to become the kind of man his father had been, a man who treated loyalty like something you simply purchased when you needed it. "I want to be different," he told her that night, "and with you, I think I actually can be." Madison believed him completely, and that belief was the first mistake that love ever convinced her to make feel reasonable. It would not be the last. Years passed. Ethan's father died, and the Carter empire passed fully into his hands, along with his mother Elina, who made absolutely certain that the old family poison did not die quietly alongside her husband. Elina moved through the family mansion like a shadow wrapped in silk, correcting Ethan at breakfast, reshaping his instincts before board meetings, reminding him constantly that sentiment had very nearly ruined his father's legacy. "Your wife is sweet," Elina would say at dinner, with a smile that never once reached her eyes, but sweetness does not protect an empire. At first, Ethan defended Madison against these comments. He held her hand beneath the table during Elina's sharper remarks. He kissed her forehead before important meetings, and told her not to worry when a woman named Vanessa Monroe began appearing more frequently around the executive floor, laughing too easily at Ethan's jokes, and touching his sleeve in ways that felt rehearsed rather than accidental. Something shifted slowly after that, so slowly that Madison spent months blaming herself for even noticing it. The hand beneath the table disappeared first. The forehead kisses became rushed, almost obligatory. The late meetings stretched even later into the night. And one evening, standing outside Ethan's study months before their daughter was born, Madison overheard Elina say something she would never fully forget. "Vanessa understands your world," Elina told her son. "Madison only understands your heart. One of those things will make you stronger. The other will only make you weak." Madison waited, standing in that hallway, for Ethan to say something in her defense. He never did. That silence, more than anything Elina ever said directly, became the clearest prophecy of everything that followed. The first real fracture in the marriage came the night of the annual Carter Foundation Gala, when Madison was 4 months pregnant and wearing a pale blue gown Ethan had personally selected, telling her it made her look soft. Vanessa arrived that night in silver, escorted by no one in particular and welcomed instantly by everyone in the room. Elina seated Vanessa directly at Ethan's right hand and placed Madison 3 seats down, beside an elderly donor who asked her twice, with genuine confusion, whether she was part of the catering staff. Later that evening, Madison found her husband alone on the balcony, with Vanessa's hand resting against his chest. He stepped back quickly when he noticed Madison standing there, but not quickly enough for either of them to pretend it had not happened. "It's not what you think," he told her. "What do I think?" she asked. He had no answer for her at all. That night, Madison slept alone in the nursery she had only just finished decorating, sitting beneath a hand-painted ceiling of soft clouds with one hand resting on her belly. "I hope you never have to beg someone to choose you," she whispered to the daughter she had not yet met. The next morning she called Charles Whitmore and asked him to look closely into the debt structure underneath Carter Global Holdings. "Are you sure about this?" Charles asked her carefully. "No," Madison admitted. "That is exactly why I need the facts." And the facts, once they began arriving, came in like a slow, relentless storm. Carter Global was not the fortress everyone assumed it to be, Ethan's father had expanded far too aggressively in his final years, borrowed heavily against future projections, and quietly buried losses inside subsidiaries with names so forgettable that nobody had ever bothered to read their filings closely. Ethan had inherited a beautiful palace with termites already eating through the walls. Madison began watching everything after that, carefully, the way her father had once taught her to read a room full of numbers. She watched Ethan take important calls behind closed doors. She watched Alina quietly invite private bankers to long lunches that were never mentioned at dinner. She watched Vanessa whisper encouragement into Ethan's ear during the day, while building her own private escape plan in the background. And she watched, piece by careful piece, as the company's distressed debt slowly became available through financial channels that Ethan never once imagined his quiet, overlooked wife had access to. Every small insult Madison absorbed during those months became information. Every closed door taught her exactly where to look for a key. Every time Ethan dismissed her concerns as emotional or unimportant, she simply became more precise in her planning, more patient in her timing. Still, some part of her kept hoping she would never actually have to use any of it. That hope finally died 2 weeks before Madison gave birth. Ethan came home one night near midnight, smelling faintly of Vanessa's perfume and expensive whiskey. Madison was standing barefoot in the kitchen drinking water because the baby had been restless for hours and sleep simply would not come. He stopped when he saw her there, irritation flashing briefly across his face. "You're still awake," he said. "So are you," she replied. He loosened his tie without answering and told her, almost wearily, not to start. Madison looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time saw not the dreamer from the gas station years earlier, but Alina's son fully formed, polished and proud, and strangely hollow in the places love used to occupy. "Are you in love with her?" Madison finally asked him directly. He laughed under his breath. "You're pregnant and emotional," he said, instead of answering. "Answer me," Madison said again, quietly. His eyes hardened. "Vanessa doesn't make everything feel like a trial," he told her. The words were not shouted, which somehow made them land even harder. "And what do I make things feel like?" Madison asked, setting her water glass down carefully on the counter. "Small," he said. The moment the word left his mouth, something shifted visibly across his own face, as though he understood instantly that he had opened a door that could never fully close again. But pride pushed him through it anyway. "You make me feel small, Madison," he continued, "like I'm always disappointing you somehow. Vanessa believes in me." Madison nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "No, Ethan," she said quietly. "Vanessa believes in what she thinks you own." He stepped closer to her, his voice low and tight. "You know nothing about my world," he said. Madison almost smiled at that, not because anything about the moment was funny, but because fate, as it often does, had a cruel sense of timing. Behind him, through the kitchen window, lightning briefly lit up the sky. 3 days later, divorce papers arrived. 1 week after that, their daughter, Ava, was born. Ethan did not arrive at the hospital until the following morning, walking in alongside his mother, who carried a bouquet of flowers, the way someone carries an obligation, rather than a gift. Vanessa waited downstairs in a car the entire time, a detail Madison only learned because one of the nurses happened to mention a woman sitting in a black sedan, repeatedly asking how much longer Mr. Carter would be. Ethan held his newborn daughter for less than 2 minutes before handing her back. "She's small," he said. "She's perfect," Madison corrected him. Alina glanced briefly at the baby and sighed. "Well, at least she has the Carter eyes," she said. Madison's own mother, Diane, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, rose to her feet immediately. Madison caught her wrist gently before she could speak, holding her back from a confrontation that would not have changed anything. After Ethan left the hospital room that day, Diane sat beside her daughter's bed and cried silently. Madison did not cry. She simply watched the door close behind her husband and remembered, with sudden clarity, her father's old warning, folded away in a locked drawer for years. Then she picked up her phone and sent a single message to Charles Whitmore. "Move forward," it read. By the time Ethan's legal team scheduled the courthouse meeting that would formally end the marriage, the acquisition Madison had quietly assembled over many months was already fully in motion. Whitestone Meridian had not approached Carter Global from the front. It had moved in carefully through distressed debt, voting rights, and emergency liquidity agreements, the kind of slow, patient maneuvering that powerful men rarely notice until it is far too late to undo. Madison signed the final controlling documents at 2:17 in the morning, while baby Ava slept peacefully in a bassinet beside her. Grace Whitmore, Charles's daughter and Madison's attorney, was there with her sleeves rolled up and her eyes red from exhaustion. Charles himself was there too, older now, and walking with a cane, smiling the way a man smiles when he has just watched justice finally put on a tailored suit. "Once this is signed," Grace warned her quietly, "there is no soft version of whatever happens next." Madison looked down at her sleeping daughter for a long moment. "He already chose the hard version," she said simply, and signed her name. Somewhere across the city that same night, Ethan Carter raised a glass of champagne beside Vanessa and his mother, fully believing that Madison Carter was finished, defeated, and no longer worth a second thought. That belief died completely the moment Grace Whitmore stood up in the courtroom and opened a thin black folder. "Carter Global Holdings," she announced calmly, "has been under severe private debt restructuring for the past 18 months. Several key subsidiaries had been pledged as collateral during that period. 3 nights ago, those debt instruments, along with controlling shares of the company, were formally acquired by an outside firm called Whitestone Meridian Capital." Ethan frowned, clearly confused about what any of this had to do with his soon-to-be ex-wife. Grace turned to the next page in her folder without rushing. "Whitestone Meridian Capital," she continued, "is a privately held acquisition firm. Its controlling owner is Madison Carter." Vanessa made a small, involuntary sound somewhere between a laugh and a choke. Ethan's face went completely pale and empty. Alina stood up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the courtroom floor. "That is a lie," she said sharply. "Sit down, Mrs. Carter," the judge warned her immediately, "or leave my courtroom entirely." Ethan grabbed the documents directly from his own attorney's hands before the man could stop him, his eyes scanning the pages too quickly at first, searching desperately for some kind of mistake, a forged signature, a missing seal, any small crack in what was becoming an impossible truth to deny. The longer he read, the paler his face became. In that moment, Madison watched her husband finally discover her, not the quiet wife he had grown comfortable ignoring, not the woman he had casually humiliated in front of his entire legal team, but the actual woman he had genuinely never bothered to know. "You own Whitestone," he said slowly, looking up at her. "Yes," Madison said. "You never told me," he said. "You never asked," she replied. "What I did once you decided I was only your wife." "That's impossible," Vanessa interjected, her voice suddenly thin and uncertain. "I searched her," she insisted, looking around the room. "Everyone knows she came from nothing." Madison turned to look at her directly. "You searched the name Madison Carter," she said calmly. "You should have searched Madison Reed." Vanessa's cheeks flushed deeply, because it was entirely true. She had searched old social media accounts, charity event photographs, wedding announcements, anything that might confirm her own sense of superiority. What she found instead was a scholarship student with a deceased father and a modest, hard-working mother. No scandal, no hidden fortune, no powerful family connections she could exploit. Vanessa had simply mistaken Madison's privacy for emptiness. Alina had made that exact same mistake for years, calling Madison simple in rooms where she assumed Madison could not hear her. Simple taste, simple background, simple mind. While Madison quietly refilled water glasses and memorized the face of every single person who laughed along politely. Ethan stood abruptly from his chair, his composure finally beginning to crack. "This is fraud," he said loudly. Grace folded her hands calmly on the table in front of her. "No, Mr. Carter," she replied evenly. "This is simply business." Alina's voice shook with barely controlled rage. "You planned this entire thing," she said, pointing directly at Madison. Madison finally turned to face her former mother-in-law fully. "No, Alina," she said, "you planned it. You taught your son that I was powerless. You told him directly to throw me out of this room. I simply allowed you to speak loudly enough for everyone present to hear exactly what kind of family you actually are." The words landed across the courtroom like glass, shattering against marble. Several of the company's board members seated near the back of the room, who had arrived expecting to quietly support Ethan through a routine divorce, suddenly found themselves unable to meet his eyes at all. One of those executives, the company's chief financial officer, a man named Martin Vale, looked physically ill. He had known for months that the company was financially vulnerable. He had simply never imagined that the buyer waiting in the shadows would turn out to be Madison. He also understood, almost instantly, exactly what she now controlled. Contracts, voting authority, emergency board powers, the ability to remove any single executive who had quietly helped conceal the company's financial rot for years. Madison looked at him for less than a second. He understood completely. His entire career began trembling before his hands ever did. The judge cleared his throat firmly. "Mr. Holloway," he said to Ethan's attorney, "I strongly suggest you confer with your client." But Ethan was no longer listening to legal advice of any kind. Pride had already closed its hands firmly around his throat. "You think this makes you powerful," he said, pointing at Madison. "You think buying debt makes you one of us?" "One of you," Madison repeated softly. "Yes," Alina snapped immediately. "You may have stolen your way into papers and signatures, but blood is blood. You are not a Carter." Madison smiled then, small and calm, and absolutely devastating. "Thank God," she said quietly. Vanessa stood abruptly, panic finally breaking through her carefully polished exterior. "Ethan, say something," she pleaded. "Tell them this can somehow be reversed." Ethan turned desperately to his attorney. "Can it?" he asked. Mr. Holloway simply removed his glasses without answering. That silence was answer enough for everyone in the room. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what Madison does in the weeks following this courtroom moment is the part of this story that changes everything you think you know about quiet women and powerful families. Madison rose to her feet slowly, adjusting her sleeping daughter gently against her chest. "I have no interest in dragging this divorce out any longer than necessary," she said calmly. "I will keep what is legally mine. You will keep your personal belongings. Carter Global will be restructured immediately, beginning Monday morning. Alina will vacate her advisory office by Monday as well. Vanessa Monroe is banned from all Carter Global properties effective immediately." Vanessa gasped audibly. "You can't do that," she said. Madison glanced briefly at her own old wedding diamonds, now resting against Vanessa's collarbone. "I can do far more than that," she said quietly. "Be grateful I am starting there." Ethan's face twisted with frustration. "You don't get to humiliate me," he said. Madison looked slowly around the courtroom before meeting his eyes again. "Ethan," she said, "I did not bring your lover to my own divorce. I did not let my mother insult the mother of my child in front of strangers. I did not order security to remove a newborn from a room. You built this entire humiliation yourself. I simply turned on the lights." For one brief second, something genuinely human flickered across Ethan's expression, something that resembled shame, or perhaps memory. Madison wondered, watching him, whether he too remembered the gas station, the rain, the young man who had once sworn he would never become his own parents. But the flicker passed quickly, and his pride survived in a way his love clearly had not. "This isn't over," he said finally. "No," Madison agreed quietly. "It is not." Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters and cameras had already gathered, arranged earlier that morning at Ethan's own request. He had wanted the world to witness him walking out victorious, Vanessa at his side, Madison trailing behind them, defeated and erased. Alina had personally approved the plan. Vanessa had chosen her outfit specifically for the cameras. They had expected a performance. What they received instead was something else entirely. The courthouse doors opened, and Madison stepped outside first, sunlight catching her face as baby Ava slept peacefully against her chest. Grace walked beside her, still carrying the same black folder that had just quietly detonated an entire family empire. Behind them came Ethan, pale and furious, followed by Vanessa, mascara already gathering faintly at the corners of her eyes, and Alina, gripping her handbag so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Reporters surged forward immediately. "Mrs. Carter, is it true you acquired Carter Global?" one shouted. "Mr. Carter, did you know your wife owned Whitestone Meridian?" another called out. "Mrs. Carter, what happens to the family business now?" Ethan attempted to step in front of Madison, but security moved quickly to block him. Not courthouse security, and not Carter family security, but Whitestone Meridian's own private protection team, forming a quiet, respectful line around Madison and her daughter. Madison paused briefly at the top of the courthouse steps as microphones lifted toward her like metal flowers. She had not planned to say anything further, but Ava made a small sound in her sleep just then, and Madison found herself thinking about every room her daughter would one day walk into, rooms where people might judge her by her softness, her name, her silence, mistaking patience for weakness, the same way so many had once mistaken Madison's own quiet nature. She looked directly into the cameras. "Carter Global will continue operating," she said clearly. "Employees will be protected. Mismanagement will not be tolerated. The company is entering a new era of accountability, and every person who has used their power to harm others will eventually answer for it." A reporter called out, asking about her marriage. "My marriage ended," Madison said simply, "when my husband confused loyalty with weakness." Alina stepped forward then, unable to stop herself. "This is a private family matter," she said sharply. Madison turned to face her directly. "It stopped being private," she replied, "the moment you told your son to remove my newborn from a courtroom." The cameras swung immediately toward Alina, and for the first time in her entire life, Alina Carter found herself standing in a room with no powerful enough corner left to hide inside. By that evening, every financial news network in the country was discussing the acquisition. By midnight, Carter Global's board had requested an emergency meeting. By the following morning, Ethan's phone had filled with messages from investors, longtime partners, old friends, and enemies pretending, just barely, to be concerned for his well-being. Vanessa stayed at Ethan's penthouse that night, though she did not touch him once. She paced restlessly near the windows, still wearing the diamonds, searching online for any sign, any loophole, any rumor suggesting Madison's new ownership might somehow collapse. "This doesn't make any sense," she kept repeating quietly to herself. "Women like her don't simply own companies like that." Ethan sat alone in the darkness with a drink he never actually touched. "Women like her," the phrase crawled uncomfortably under his skin, because he realized, sitting there in the silence, that he had believed exactly the same thing for years without ever questioning it. He remembered Madison in their very first apartment, long before the mansion, sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by spreadsheets across 3 different monitors. He used to joke that she looked like she was planning to overthrow an entire country. She would simply smile without looking up and say, "Not a country." He had assumed it was a harmless joke at the time. He remembered her asking sharp, pointed questions about acquisition debt and voting structures during dinner with his father years earlier. His own father had stared at her for several uncomfortable seconds before finally saying, "You understand finance." Madison had simply replied, "Enough." Afterward, Ethan had teased her gently for making his father uncomfortable. "Powerful men," she told him then, "are only uncomfortable when they sense someone in the room can read the fine print." He had kissed her that night, genuinely proud of her. He could no longer remember exactly when that pride had quietly curdled into resentment. At 3 in the morning, Vanessa finally said aloud what fear had been building inside her all night. "What happens to me?" she asked. Ethan looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" he said. "My brand deals," she continued. "My invitations. My seat on the charity board. The apartment you promised me. If she controls the entire company now, what happens to me?" Something cold and uncomfortably clear moved through Ethan's chest in that moment. Madison, he realized, had been right about her the entire time. Vanessa had never once asked what would happen to him. She had only ever asked what would happen to herself. By Monday morning, Madison walked into Carter Global headquarters, not as Ethan's wife, not as Alina's disappointment, and not as the woman staff once quietly pitied whenever Vanessa swept confidently through the lobby beside Ethan. She entered the building as chairwoman. The entire lobby seemed to shift before she even said a single word. Receptionists straightened immediately. Executives gathered near the elevators with the nervous posture of people who had spent years quietly laughing at the wrong woman. Security personally opened the private executive gate for her. The same polished marble floors that had once carried her silently behind her husband now reflected her footsteps walking alone, deliberate and unhurried. Ava was not with her that morning. Madison had left her safely at home with Diane, who had kissed her daughter's forehead before she left and whispered, "Your father would have loved this part." Madison had smiled faintly in response. He warned me about this part, she said quietly. At the top floor, the boardroom waited. Alina was already seated inside, positioned at the far end of the long table, as though that particular chair still somehow belonged to her. Ethan stood near the window, arms crossed. Vanessa was noticeably absent, the building access ban having already taken effect. Martin Vale sat nervously with two legal advisors, visibly sweating through his collar. Madison entered with Grace, Charles, and a small restructuring team trailing behind her. No one in the room spoke as she walked directly to the head of the table. "That seat belonged to my husband," Alina said sharply, her eyes burning. Madison placed her folder calmly on the table in front of her. "And then to your son," she replied, "and now to me. That is simply how ownership works." Ethan muttered something under his breath about her enjoying this. Madison looked directly at him. "No," she said evenly. "I enjoyed loving you. I enjoyed believing in you. I enjoyed building a nursery for our daughter, while hoping you would come home one day as the man you once promised me you would be. This part, Ethan, I earned." The board members lowered their eyes around the table. Madison opened the meeting with numbers, not emotion, not revenge, simply numbers. She methodically exposed hidden debt, wasteful spending patterns, executive bonuses paid out while entire departments were quietly being cut, luxury retreats disguised as strategic planning sessions, contracts awarded to Alina's personal friends, and consulting payments routed directly to a shell company tied to Vanessa, for services nobody in the room could actually prove had ever been performed. Vanessa's name appearing on the projected screen turned Ethan's face visibly gray. Madison herself had not known about that particular detail until 2 days after giving birth, sitting up in her hospital bed with Ava sleeping peacefully beside her, scrolling through financial records and discovering a shell company, a recurring monthly fee, and Ethan's own signature authorizing the payment. Not simply betrayal, she realized in that moment, but financed betrayal. Alina attempted to interrupt the presentation. "Those arrangements were entirely standard," she insisted. Madison clicked calmly to the next slide without pausing. "No," she said. "They were theft disguised as arrogance." Martin Vale whispered her name nervously. "Chairwoman Carter." Grace corrected him immediately. Martin swallowed hard. "Chairwoman Carter," he said. "I was simply acting under instruction." Madison looked at him steadily. "So was everyone," she replied. "Who has ever chosen wrongly, and then expected pity afterward?" By the end of that meeting, 3 senior executives had already resigned. 2 others were placed under formal investigation. Alina's advisory position was terminated immediately. Ethan was removed from operational control of the company, pending a full review. The board voted unanimously, under the sheer weight of documentation they simply could not deny. Alina did not shout when the vote concluded. That, Madison understood, would have given her too much satisfaction. Instead, Alina approached her slowly, once the room had mostly emptied. "You think this makes you safe?" she asked quietly. Madison closed her folder calmly. "No," she replied. "It makes me prepared." "You have no idea what families like mine survive," Alina said. Madison stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Alina could hear her clearly. "And you," she said, "have no idea what women like me remember." For the very first time, something that genuinely resembled fear crossed Alina's expression. Weeks passed, and the Carter family name continued collapsing publicly, while the company itself slowly began healing under Madison's leadership. She kept every existing employee. She froze unnecessary executive luxuries immediately. She sold 3 private jets and redirected the funds toward genuine financial stabilization. She personally met with department heads Ethan had ignored for years. She walked factory floors, visited regional offices in person, and spent far more time listening than speaking. Stories began circulating quietly among staff. The new chairwoman remembered names. The chairwoman personally answered emails. The chairwoman carried no entourage, unless one was strictly necessary. The chairwoman had once been laughed at quietly by some of the very same people who now found themselves begging to keep their jobs. Madison did not humiliate everyone who had ever underestimated her, only those who had actively harmed others while doing it. That distinction made her, in many ways, even more frightening to the people who remembered how she used to be treated. Ethan watched from an increasing distance as the company's stock slowly stabilized and then began rising steadily. Reporters who had once referred to Madison as the abandoned wife began calling her the architect behind the entire Carter rescue. Business publications requested interviews. Former investors who had quietly pulled away began cautiously returning. Employees posted anonymous accounts online describing reversed unfair severances, restored benefits, and corrupt managers finally being removed. Ethan should have felt some measure of relief watching his family's company recover. Instead, he simply felt replaced. One evening, he arrived unannounced at Madison's new home, a large, elegant, and entirely private house, nothing like the Carter mansion, with warm light glowing in the windows and a small garden just beginning to bloom, the kind of home Madison would naturally choose for herself, beautiful, without ever needing to beg anyone to notice. Diane answered the door holding Ava, her expression hardening instantly at the sight of him. "No," she said firmly. Ethan looked past her toward his daughter, who stared back at him with wide, curious eyes. Eyes Alina had once described as unmistakably Carter eyes. But Ethan saw something else entirely in that moment. Madison's calm, Madison's softness, and an unmistakably terrifying future neither of them could fully predict yet. "I need to speak to Madison," he said quietly. Diane nearly closed the door entirely, but Madison appeared behind her before she could. "It's okay, Mom," she said gently. Madison stepped onto the porch and closed the door softly behind her. Ethan had rehearsed several different sentences during the drive over, apologies, explanations, accusations carefully disguised as apologies. But standing in front of her now, he realized that every single sentence he had prepared sounded exactly like a man trying to recover access rather than actual love. "You should have told me," he said finally. Madison's expression remained steady. "That is what you came here to say?" she asked. "I was your husband," he replied. "You were my husband," Madison said quietly, "when you brought your mistress to our own divorce proceedings." He looked away, the night air smelling faintly of approaching rain. For a brief, painful moment, he found himself remembering the gas station again, a younger Madison laughing as thunder cracked somewhere overhead, a younger Ethan swearing he would never hurt her the way his own father had hurt his mother. "I lost myself," he said quietly. Madison's eyes softened slightly, but only slightly. "No, Ethan," she said. "You chose yourself. There is a difference." "I want to see Ava," he said. "You will," she replied. "Through the custody schedule our attorneys arrange." His jaw tightened visibly. "You don't trust me," he said. "I trust patterns," Madison replied evenly. "That's not fair," he said. Madison looked at him with quiet disbelief. "Fair," she repeated. "I gave birth while your lover waited downstairs in a car outside the hospital. I carried our daughter into a courtroom where your own mother called us both powerless. You stood there and let security reach toward me while I held our newborn child. Do not come to my door now asking for fairness, because consequences have simply learned your address." Ethan absorbed her words like a series of physical blows, having no real argument left to offer. "I loved you," he whispered finally. Madison's expression shifted then, something resembling grief passing briefly across her face. Not weakness, not lingering longing, but grief for a version of the two of them that had quietly died over time, without ever receiving any kind of proper farewell. "I know," she said softly. "That is exactly what made it hurt so much." He looked at her, genuinely desperate now. "And now?" he asked. "Now," Madison said, "I love my daughter far more than I miss her father." From inside the house, Ava began to cry, small and insistent. Madison turned immediately toward the sound. That single quick movement answered every remaining question Ethan had carried with him to her door that night. He was no longer the center of her world. He had become barely a shadow at its furthest edge. A month later, Vanessa attempted to sell her own version of the story to a tabloid, claiming Madison had manipulated Ethan from the very beginning, trapped him deliberately, stolen the family company, and used motherhood purely for public sympathy. The tabloid had been fully prepared to publish the story, right up until Grace Whitmore sent over a legal packet containing contracts, payment trails, and text messages clearly documenting Vanessa's fraudulent consulting payments from Carter Global accounts. The story quietly disappeared. Instead, an entirely different headline appeared 2 days later. Vanessa Monroe under investigation for fraudulent corporate payments. Vanessa called Ethan 17 times that week. He answered exactly once. "You said you would protect me," she cried into the phone. Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by furniture Vanessa had personally chosen, and a silence Madison would have once filled effortlessly with warmth. "I can't even protect myself anymore," he said quietly. She cursed at him and hung up. He never called her back. Alina lasted somewhat longer than Vanessa, refusing to leave the Carter family mansion, even after ownership of certain company-held properties had already legally transferred. She continued hosting small lunches. She continued wearing her diamonds. She told friends repeatedly that Madison's control over the company was only temporary. But invitations gradually slowed. Phone calls increasingly went unanswered. Women who had once openly feared her now quietly pitied her in public and mocked her privately behind closed doors. Her final public humiliation arrived at the annual Carter Foundation charity event. Madison attended as both chairwoman and primary donor that year, wearing a modest emerald gown, carrying herself like a woman no room could ever again reduce, speaking publicly about ethical leadership, employee dignity, and the slow process of rebuilding institutions that had once confused wealth with actual worth. Alina sat in the audience that evening, not at the prestigious front table she had occupied for decades, but 3 rows back among the other guests. Ethan watched quietly from the side of the room. When Madison finished her speech, the applause that followed was immediate and sustained. Alina did not clap at first. Then the woman seated beside her did. Then the man behind her joined in. Then everyone around her began applauding as well. Slowly, with cameras nearby and pride burning like acid somewhere in her throat, Alina finally lifted her own hands and began to clap along with everyone else. Madison saw it happen from the stage. She gave absolutely no outward sign of triumph. Somehow, that restraint made the moment even worse for Alina than open mockery ever could have. After the gala ended, Ethan found his mother standing alone in a long hallway lined with portraits of Carter men, founders, chairmen, builders, men staring down from gilded frames, as though history itself belonged permanently to them. "They will put her portrait there," Alina said quietly, gesturing toward an empty space at the end of the wall where Ethan's own portrait had once been planned. Ethan followed her gaze in silence. He expected the idea to enrage him. Instead, it simply exhausted him completely. "She saved the company," he said quietly. "She stole it," Alina snapped back immediately. "No," Ethan said. "We lost it long before she ever arrived." Alina's face tightened sharply. "You sound like her now," she said. "Maybe that means I'm finally telling the truth," he replied. She slapped him then. Not hard enough to actually injure him, but hard enough to crack through the hallway like an old family curse finally breaking open after decades of silence. Ethan touched his cheek slowly and looked at his mother, seeing for perhaps the very first time the frightened woman hidden behind the pearls and the carefully maintained composure, not powerful at all, but genuinely terrified. Terrified of becoming ordinary. Terrified that without the Carter name, without the mansion, without unquestioning obedience surrounding her, she was simply a woman who had spent decades teaching her own son exactly how to destroy his own happiness. "I became exactly what you wanted," Ethan said quietly, "and it cost me absolutely everything." Alina's lips trembled slightly, but no apology ever followed. Decades of Carter pride had trained her far too thoroughly for that. Winter eventually turned slowly into spring. Madison's life did not become entirely painless, but it gradually became honest. Ava grew round-cheeked and bright-eyed, learning to crawl across the floors of their new home. Diane moved closer to be near her growing granddaughter. Grace became not only Madison's trusted attorney, but a genuine close friend. Charles visited every Sunday afternoon, holding Ava with the careful, awkward tenderness of a man who had successfully negotiated billion-dollar corporate deals throughout his career, yet still feared accidentally dropping a baby. Sometimes, late at night, Madison still found herself remembering Ethan exactly as he had once been. Memory, she discovered, could be remarkably cruel in that particular way. It refused to erase the good, simply because the bad had ultimately won out. She remembered dancing together in their very first kitchen, both of them laughing because neither could afford proper furniture yet, somehow still feeling impossibly rich regardless. She remembered him reading business books aloud in bed, mispronouncing French company names until she gently corrected him each time. She remembered the rain at the gas station. But then Ava would stir nearby, and Madison would gently return her attention to the present moment. The past, she came to understand, was simply a room she could occasionally visit. It was no longer a house she was required to live inside permanently. On Ava's first birthday, Madison hosted a small, intimate gathering in their garden. No cameras, no executives, no society guests of any kind. Simply family, close friends, warm sunlight, fresh flowers, and a small pink cake that Ava mostly destroyed enthusiastically with both hands. Ethan attended for exactly 1 hour. He arrived alone, without Alina, without Vanessa, without any trace of his former arrogance. He brought a simple gift, a small music box shaped like a carousel. Madison recognized it immediately. Years earlier, before everything between them had gone wrong, they had once passed an antique shop together and noticed the exact same music box displayed in the window. Madison had mentioned then that if they ever had a daughter, she would love to buy her something just like it. Ethan had remembered that small detail all these years later. Somehow, that fact hurt far more deeply than if he had simply forgotten it entirely. Ava reached toward him curiously as he approached, uncertain but interested. Madison allowed him to hold her carefully. He did so with genuine reverence, as though finally understanding, perhaps for the first time, that a child was never simply an extension of his family name, but an entire life he now had to earn his way into honestly. "She looks like you when she's judging people," Ethan said softly, watching his daughter's serious expression. Madison almost smiled despite herself. "Then she'll be just fine," she replied. He looked at her carefully. "Are you fine?" he asked. "No," Madison said, watching Ava tug curiously at his collar. "I am healing." "That is considerably better than simply pretending to be fine." Ethan nodded slowly. For once, he did not argue with her assessment. Before leaving that afternoon, he paused near the garden gate. "Madison," he said. She turned to face him fully. "I'm sorry," he said simply. The words carried no hidden excuse attached to them, no quiet request for forgiveness buried inside, no demand of any kind. Madison studied him carefully for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I hope you become someone Ava can genuinely be proud of one day." It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was not punishment, either. It was simply a door left deliberately unlocked, though not yet fully open. Ethan accepted that small offering as though it were considerably more mercy than he honestly believed he deserved. Years later, people would still occasionally tell the story of the day Madison Carter walked into a courthouse, carrying a newborn, and walked back out, carrying an entire empire instead. Some versions of the story would exaggerate certain details. Others would soften them considerably. Over time, gossip would gradually sharpen Madison into something resembling a legend. Some people would insist she had planned the entire revenge from the very beginning. Others would claim she had never genuinely loved Ethan at all. Some would simply call her cold and calculating. They would all, in their own way, be wrong. Madison had loved deeply and completely. That was precisely why her husband's betrayal had never made her foolish. It had made her wide awake instead. She had never actually wanted a kingdom of her own. She had simply wanted a stable, loving family. But when the family she had married into attempted to strip away her dignity, her security, her motherhood, and her basic peace of mind, they discovered, far too late, that the quiet woman sitting patiently in the corner had been carefully reading every number, every room, and every silence around her the entire time. She had learned, finally and completely, the exact lesson her own father had left behind for her. When people want to hide the truth, they bury it carefully inside numbers. When people want to hide cruelty, they bury it just as carefully inside good manners. And when powerful people convince themselves that a quiet woman has nothing left to lose, they often fail to notice that she is still quietly holding on to the one thing they can never simply buy back from her: proof. Madison kept her father's old, scratched wristwatch on her desk at Carter Global headquarters, positioned beside a small framed photograph of Ava laughing in their garden. Visitors occasionally noticed the plain, worn watch and wondered privately why a billionaire chairwoman would choose to display something so unremarkable in her office. Madison never bothered explaining it to anyone. She never felt she needed to. Every quiet tick of that old watch, reminded her that time eventually reveals exactly what pride works so hard to bury. Every tick reminded her that silence is never the same thing as surrender. And every tick reminded her of the exact day Ethan Carter once laughed confidently in a courtroom, fully believing he had simply thrown away a powerless, overlooked woman, only to discover, far too late, that he had actually handed his entire kingdom over to its rightful queen all along.